The French Revolution had just devoured its own. After the absolute chaos of the Reign of Terror and the fall of Robespierre, France was just exhausted.
Completely. And the big question for everyone left was, terrifyingly simple.
How do you build a government that's strong enough to actually rule, but is also designed so it can never, ever become a dictatorship again?
That anxiety is at the core of everything. They saw how lethal centralized power could be. So in 1795, they tried to basically vaccinate the country against tyranny.
And they did that by drafting a brand new constitution, creating the system we now call the Directory.
Yeah, and it was a really short-lived experiment, just 5 years, from 1795 to 1799. But it was so important.
It was built on this idea of like perfect balance and separating all the powers. But what really happened was just gridlock, corruption, and failure.
Total failure.
Yeah.
And that instability created the perfect opening for Napoleon Bonaparte to step in.
So today we're going to get into this moment. We'll look at the super complex design of the Directory and figure out why it led to paralysis instead of stability.
And we'll see how economic collapse and just rampant corruption made people lose all faith in the government.
Until the military became the only part of the country that actually worked. And then, well, the military decided to take over.
Okay, so let's start with the design. The architecture of anti-dictatorship, as you could call it.
They needed to make sure no single group could run away with the revolution again, so they set up what's called a bicameral system.
Which just means a legislature with 2 houses or 2 chambers, and each one had a very specific job.
First, you had the lower house, the Council of 500.
Their role was just to generate ideas. They were the idea factory. They would debate and then propose new laws.
And you had to be at least 30 years old to be in that group. But the real break on any radical ideas was the other house, the Council of Ancients.
Exactly. The ancients had 250 members, and their job was really simple. They could only accept or reject what the 500 sent them.
So a straight up or down vote, no amendments, no changes.
None. It was a take it or leave it deal. But what's really telling is who could be in this council.
Right. You had to be at least 40 years old. And this is the key part. You had to be married or a widower.
And that wasn't random. It was a deeply political move. They were terrified of the young, passionate, unmarried Jacobins who had driven the Reign of Terror.
They were trying to build a government of, well, cautious older guys with property.
Exactly. They wanted stability and conservatism more than anything else. They even made the 2 houses work in separate buildings to make sure they couldn't team up.
A literal separation of powers.
It is. But this rigid separation had a huge, crippling flaw. It was designed to stop rapid action, which meant the government was incredibly slow.
So when a crisis hit, like, say, the economy collapsing or a rebellion,
The 2 houses would just deadlock, and the executive branch was left with no legal way to do anything about it.
and that executive branch was the directors. These were the 5 men who were supposed to actually run the country.
Right? They were chosen by the ancients from a list that the 500 created, and their powers were huge on paper.
Things like managing foreign policy, commanding the army, collecting taxes, enforcing laws.
All the stuff a government does. But again, that fear of a dictator was built right into this system.
The directors were not allowed to propose laws themselves. They couldn't even go into the legislative chambers.
And one of the 5 directors had to resign every single year.
Every year, that's so much turnover. The government would constantly be losing its memory, its coherence.
It's fascinating. They designed the executive and legislative branches to be almost hostile to each other. They were supposed to check each other's power.
But in a crisis, they just checked each other into complete paralysis.
And those crises hit right away. The political design was one thing, but the country was just falling apart financially.
Yeah, let's get into that. The biggest problem was hyperinflation. The government was printing paper money called assignats.
And they just kept printing more and more to pay for everything, especially the wars.
So the money became worthless. I mean, literally. It lost value so fast, it was like scrap paper.
Imagine going to buy bread, and the price goes from, say, 100 francs one week to 5,000 the next. It destroys society.
Farmers just stopped selling their food. Why sell your crops for paper that would be worthless by tomorrow?
So you had severe food shortages in the cities. And at the same time, the new rich elite were throwing these lavish parties. The gap between the starving poor and the wealthy was massive.
The government tried to fix it right. They got rid of the assignats, they tried new money, but the national debt was just too big.
They couldn't even pay their own soldiers and officials reliably. And this desperation, it just fueled political chaos.
The Directory was getting attacked from all sides.
Constantly. From the political right, you had the royalists. They wanted to tear down the republic and bring back a king.
And they weren't just debating. In 1795, they staged a major uprising in Paris, actually attacking government buildings.
The government barely survived that. And then on the other side, from the left, you had radicals.
Like the Conspiracy of Equals, led by Gracchus Babeuf.
Yeah, they wanted to go back to the most extreme revolutionary ideas, like abolishing all private property.
So the directors were always using the army and the police to crush these movements, left and right. This government that was designed for balance could only rule by force.
And then there was the corruption. This is where they really lost the people.
It was everywhere. Public officials, even some of the directors themselves, were openly taking bribes for government contracts.
But the corruption also poisoned the whole idea of democracy. When elections happened, if the government didn't like the results,
They just canceled them.
exactly. In 1797, when Royalists won a bunch of seats, the directors didn't argue in court. They called in the army, kicked out the elected officials, and just nullified the election.
So the system was a sham. People could see it. The government was incompetent, unstable, and totally corrupt.
It made everyone incredibly cynical. They were ready for any alternative. And the only part of France that seemed to be offering any success or integrity was the military.
Which brings us to the army. Because while Paris was a mess of political fights and worthless money,
France was at war with almost everybody. Great Britain, Austria, Russia, all the major powers.
and the Directory kind of needed those wars, didn't they?
They absolutely did. For one, it helped them create sister republics, which were basically buffer states to protect France from invasion. But more importantly,
It was the only thing the country could be proud of. People hated the directors, but they loved the army's victories.
and those victories paid the bills. Conquered lands, especially in Italy, were forced to send huge amounts of gold, cash, and even priceless art back to Paris,
So the army wasn't just defending the Directory, it was literally funding it.
which created a very dangerous situation. Suddenly, the generals have all this power and leverage because they're the ones bringing in the only real money the country has.
And this was the perfect environment for a talented, ambitious general to become a star.
And no one rose faster or shone brighter than Napoleon Bonaparte. He became a national hero almost overnight because of his incredible victories in the Italian campaigns.
He wasn't just a general, though. He was a political force. He had already saved the Directory back in 1795 during that royalist uprising.
Oh yeah, the famous whiff of grape shot. He used cannons to clear the streets of Paris. The government literally owed its existence to him.
But he was also a genius at public relations. This is a part that's so easy to miss.
It is. He made sure that news of his victories got back to the papers in Paris, often in newspapers he controlled. He was building his own brand.
He was crafting this image of himself as the strong, decisive leader that France needed, which was the exact opposite of the bickering, weak directors.
And he launches the expedition to Egypt in 1798. The whole thing was meant to mess with British trade routes to India.
And while the naval part of it was a bit of a disaster, the campaign itself, just the sheer drama of it, made him look like an unstoppable hero to people back home.
So his popularity just exploded. And by 1799, the directors realized they'd created a monster they couldn't control.
They were trapped. They needed his army and his money to survive, but his fame was a ticking time bomb right at the center of French politics.
The government designed to stop one man from taking power was now completely dependent on one man.
And that one man was far more popular than all five of them put together.
That couldn't last,
Yeah.
and it didn't. By 1799, the public had just given up on the Directory.
People were exhausted by the endless war, the terrible economy, the scandals. The five directors just looked weak and pathetic.
So the plot to overthrow the government actually came from inside the government.
Right. Some of the politicians looked around, saw the whole thing was about to collapse, and decided the system couldn't be fixed.
They concluded that only a strong military leader could bring back order. And they knew exactly who to call.
Napoleon.
So you have the coup of 18 Brumaire in November 1799. Napoleon comes back from Egypt and joins the blotters.
They use a fake security threat to move the legislative councils outside of Paris.
And then they just bring in the soldiers to intimidate everyone and disperse the government.
It was shockingly fast. The directors were forced to resign. Soldiers with bayonets literally cleared the politicians out of the chambers.
And just like that, The Directory was gone. That moment is really the end of the main era of the French Revolution.
In its place, they created a new government called the Consulate, led by three men.
But that was just for show. Napoleon was named First Consul, and that title, backed by the entire army, gave him almost absolute power.
And what's so striking is that almost nobody resisted. The public was so relieved to see the corrupt, chaotic Directory gone that they just went along with it.
They traded this messy, broken idea of freedom for the promise of stability from a strongman.
So, in the end, the Directory was this 5-year lesson in how a constitution can fail. It was perfectly designed to stop a dictatorship of politicians.
But in doing that, it created so much gridlock and ruin that it basically guaranteed a military dictatorship would take its place.
The great irony is that all its careful rules against tyranny just ended up creating the perfect vacuum for a much more effective and popular tyrant to fill.
It really shows that no matter how well written your constitution is, it can't save a government that doesn't solve people's basic needs and has no integrity.
And maybe that raises a bigger question for all of us. When people are exhausted by chaos, how quickly are they willing to trade their political freedoms for a simple promise of order?
Something to think about.
Good luck with your studies.